Siyam ngiphe ukuthula emoyeni wami. Ngiyasindwa imithwalo yalo mhlaba, Nkosi yami. Inkinga zalo mhlaba ziphelele kimi nje. Anginamandla wokuqhubeka ngempilo, Nkosi yami. Ngithulela mthwalo, Nkosi yami, lo mthwalo.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Spotlight Conversations. My name is Tanji Balbo. I would like to apologize for the delay. Thank you for your patience, and I hope it will be worth your wait. So today we're putting a spotlight on mental health, all things mental health. And as usual, I have a panel of well-read, well-researched experts who are going to shed a light on what we mean by mental health, and especially in relation to religion. So my panel of guests is made up of the usual guests, and then we have a specialist who has joined us as well. So I'd like to welcome back Mfundisi Nkosi. Thank you, Mfundisi, for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you.
And then we also have Mandla Msimanga, who really missed out last week, and he was like, he cannot not be here today. So welcome back, But Mandla.
Thank you very much.
And then our guest speaker is a specialist in this field. It's Dr. Mabel Khadebe, known in the Adventist circles, and you'll see soon why she's known for this topic. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
All right, so we're talking mental health, and I think as a starting point, let's maybe clarify the fundamentals. What do we mean by mental health, Dr. Khadebe? What is mental health? Just a broad definition for us.
Okay. Mental health is health, but then we are used to physical health. Here we are referring to mental health, in other words, health that relates to the brain. It refers to how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. In other words, it affects our actions. Mental health is just about our overall us. You know, it affects our productivity at work, our relationships at home, our relationships at work, and it also affects how we interpret things, our perspective of things. So when we are healthy, we have a healthy perspective. It also affects how we even in marriages, the relationship in marriage, to be healthy, mental health has to come in. So basically, it is related to physiology. So whilst we say physical health, it is related to physiology because it has to do with the brain, and the brain is part of physiology. But then, because the thinking and feeling and all those things are in the brain, then we then isolate it and say mental. So when those areas are functioning well, then we say your mental health is okay.
Wow, okay, so it actually is quite broad. So then it includes emotional well-being as well. It's not just about my thinking, but it's also about my emotional well-being as well. It's all covered in that. Yes. All right, so with the current context of COVID, studies show that there's been a rise in mental health incidents, episodes, I don't know how to put it. So when I was looking at the stats, the latest stats that the South African Depression and Anxiety Group has, and this is dated September 2020, they indicated there that there's a 65% increase in the experience of stress across the board, obviously on those who were surveyed, and a 12% increase on suicidal ideation, so those who thought about suicide. Now, this is a 65% increase from the normal before COVID stats, which were 23 suicides on average a day in South Africa across all age groups, and 230 attempted suicides a day. So this issue of mental health, as much as COVID has highlighted it, it's been there, hasn't it? It's something that we've actually been struggling with as a people, and it's not unique to South Africa as well. But these are stats that are in relation to South Africa. What causes such challenges? What causes, and I think I'm looking more specifically around the stress and depression and anxiety leading to attempts on suicide?
You mean now with COVID? With
Well, I mean in general.
In
COVID has
general.
highlighted,
In general.
but in general, yes.
In general, I can say, as long as we live this side of the world, as long as we are here on earth, we will face troubles, we will face tribulations. As the Bible says, we will face troubles and tribulations. But the Bible says, God says He's with us. He has overcome, and we must be brave. Meaning, we are facing a lot of challenges. We are facing a lot of stresses. Things are not going well. We can look at unemployment, the high rate of unemployment. You can think of the stresses that are there in those families. We can look at domestic violence, which is most of the time due to the stresses. We can look at financial problems. There are a lot of problems that we experience here on earth that are causing stress. And this stress then results into mental health issues, mental health disorders, such as depression and anxiety. However, we need to realize that it's not only the stresses that we encounter that causes anxiety and depression. There are other factors that contribute to that. The environmental factors and social factors are just additions to the causes of mental ill health.
So let me bring in the rest of the panel here. So what Dr. Khadebe is mentioning is a lot of social ills, right? So does that then mean us as a church community protected from that? Because I mean, the church is already there to help us to build a community for us. Is there maybe a different experience of it in the church community? Should there be a different experience of it in the church community, just by the virtue of what church brings into people's lives?
My take is this, the more I looked at the topic of mental health, I realized that we only tend to focus or look at it from a psychotic point of view, and not maybe on all the other disorders. For example, Dr. has actually addressed things like anxiety, depression, eating disorders, personality disorders, and all those others. So our focus and our definition has been very narrow, generally, and focus on, when you talk about mental wellness, we really mostly focus on the psychotic part. And consequently, we have actually missed a boat in terms of not understanding how all these other disorders are impacting relationships amongst us as families, us as fellow Christians, and us as a church globally. Consequently, we sometimes misinterpret some of these disorders into other things which they are not, and which really causes more challenges to the friction in the relationships. So I think for me, it's been an eye-opener to really see mental health is actually a critical, I think it's major, because we do most everything we do start from our mind. So if that perspective is not correct, almost anything else will not be right.
Mfundisi, is it really something that the church grapples with, this issue of mental health, or is it something that we should have actually under control? Because I mean, we believers, so already have a sense of support and all of that just by virtue of our beliefs.
I think we have been careless in this area. We focused on spirituality, physicality, particularly in the area of diet and education. But we have not dealt with the issues of thought and behavior, cognitive aberrations, and all these things that psychologists tend to deal with. I also want to suspect that in the African community, some of these things have been created by the overall societal space within which Africans have operated.
Please expand on that.
I don't think psychological challenges that face a colonized people are necessarily identical with those that face a colonizing community. I think in a country like South Africa, the treatment of African people would be slightly different than the treatment of white people. The haves don't think like the have-nots, generally. Yeah.
You know, you've just made me think of when I was growing up, right? When it came to things like depression and stress, we always thought into zabelungu.
Yeah.
You know, abantu abamnyama don't deal with that. If there's some mental health issues, it would be madness. Then
Yeah.
okay, that one, and you can't help that one. Maybe you were born like that. But the soft things were always identified as into zabelungu. But is that true, ma'am? That there's certain mental health situations that are particular to particular groups?
When it comes to mental health, I don't believe that. The difference is the perspective, how we see it, how we look at it, how we interpret it. We have been having things like depression and anxiety and all those things, but we were interpreting it differently. As Mfundisi has been saying, we interpreted them from our traditional view. And by interpreting them that way, even when it comes to treatment, we would treat them that way. And in Western culture, when we look from the medical perspective, then we view it differently. And mostly the medical perspective has been in the Western culture.
So isn't it then that because we're defining it this way, we're now using the medical terms to define ukutefa, for example. I don't know the English word for ukutefa. Now suddenly, akatefi, depressed. Are we not actually creating that situation by giving, because we're giving it weight rather than to say, I when we are defa, man, you know, and toughen up?
If I can answer that one. It depends on the symptoms. If we know the symptoms of depression, then we will not do that. We will know when to say depression. Because even with a medical perspective, uktefa still we would not say depression, because we would be looking at the symptoms. And if the symptoms are there, basically we are defanji.
One thing I found very interesting for me was that I discovered that about 40% of cases of mental health are actually hereditary, and only 60% is actually societal, environmental. So in other words, you know, even if no one had touched you, no society had actually impacted us, we would still have this problem. It gets much more worse when therefore you're impacted by things like this talks about into the colonization and such, because then it starts affecting even your personality and a lot of other things, because those environmental factors may cause depression, may cause anxiety, etc. So in reality, you know, external circumstances actually can either make you better or worse from a mental perspective. So it's very important that we do not underplay the external dynamics, because they really are critical. You know, if we under stress them, I think we're making a mistake, because how you react. In fact, I was reading something interesting, since this is an Adventist church. Let me just quote something from Ellen White. Ellen White was talking to her son, and Edson, who was very much depressed most of the time. And you know what she says to him? And let me quote. She says that with continual change of circumstances, change comes in our experiences. And by these changes, we are either elated or depressed. But the change of circumstances has no power to change God's relationship with us. And that's, for me, was something which because I thought, hey, in Christianity, we don't really, Christians always quote Philippians, always the happy verses. I mean, Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 and 7, be anxious for nothing. So if you are depressed or you are anxious, you are not a good Christian. They will tell you, 1 Peter 5, verse 7, cast all your cares upon him, for he cares about you. So you have no reason to be depressed. They throw Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, I can do all things. So, and the Isaiah chapter 41, verse 10, which tells you, do not fear, I'm with you. So when we look at all of these things, as Christians, we start feeling almost like we're not good Christians when we start feeling these feelings. It means that I'm actually a failure as a Christian.
And Fundis, let me bring you in here and that our pastors trained on this, because that's the first port of call, isn't it? When I'm having issues, whatever type of issues, even in terms of how I'm feeling, I go to Mfundis. Our pastors trained to handle this.
I was about to ask a question that would ultimately relate to that. Let me put the question rhetorically and then answer you. One of the challenges I have with the Christian faith generally in its communities is that in a number of areas of life, we are not clinical in our thinking. We have embraced a tradition that comes from our forefathers, and they also got it from their forefathers, and we are carrying this heritage into the past. We don't doctor it in the process, because it is impacted by vicissitudes, and there are winds, crosswinds. Some of them fracture part of this tradition. My father did not grow up in this society. There are things he said to me which I can't say to my son today, because he came from another socio-cultural milieu. Let me just give you an example. My father did not like us to visit our girlfriends alone. One day he called me and said, each time you go to your girlfriend, go with your brother. You must be two there. I could not answer back, because I did not grow up in a context that would have made me answer back. But when I was alone, I was saying, how to ultimately get married in a company of three? How to discuss certain things? You get the point? Yeah, and according to his moral code, he was trying to protect us from evil. And I granted him the right to be concerned. But I think in a church that has been impacted by other knowledge systems, it is time now that we took it upon ourselves to redefine the space in which we are. And it appears the Christian faith as part of our lives, institutionalized, has not dealt with mental issues. And in the African community, you hear expressions like, don't care about that one, and we dismiss it. Yeah, in meetings, in meetings or church meetings, there's always this one guy who will raise a particular pet subject, and he gets ignored because we have branded him. We are turned to good. We have not been clinical in our treatment of people. And I suspect this is one of the reasons why we have not been able to win everybody to Jesus Christ, even inside the church.
Wow. So just a reminder to everyone that we are live. Please remember to send your questions or your comments to our guests. So, ma'am, can I
just add
yes, thank you.
To the question that you asked about pastors being trained.
Yes.
For a very long time, pastors were not trained on mental health.
Oh, yes.
And hence their approach to this issue. And hence the churches have been where they are in terms of their interpretation or perspective of mental health. But I am encouraged to see a change. I have noticed, I'm not sure in other areas, but I have not noticed that in our union, there have been efforts to train pastors on mental health. And for quite some time, for the past 5 years, I think, I've been aware of seminars that I held there. I've been once involved there, I've quite a number of times involved there. And I have seen changes in the pastors that we have now in terms of their understanding of mental health. There's a change now from demonizing mental illness to understanding it as an illness.
So, doctor, to your point there, is there a difference then between me visiting a psychologist, a trained clinician, and me visiting a pastor in terms of how the counseling is done? Is there a difference between the church mfundisi counseling and the therapist psychologist counseling?
Yes, there is a difference. Although a difference might be very thin if the therapist is a Christian. But there is a difference in the sense that pastoral counseling concentrate more on giving hope, stressing faith and prayer, and on spirituality. Because in the treatment of mental health issues, spirituality plays a very vital role, and that's where a pastor comes in. A psychologist or counselor or what, they have their role in terms of helping you think differently, look at your thinking patterns, and look at how you feel. You think and feel, and they help you make those connections and make the necessary corrections that put you where you are. So there is a difference.
Okay, awesome. I'll come to you, Mfundisi. We have a comment here on our YouTube. Please remember to send your questions and your comments. So thank you to Gafuze. It's an interesting topic we always ignore in the black families. And I think it's touching on what you said, Mfundisi, as well, to just say, into zake is anyway. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I have a challenge in the, I think as a black church, and we're part of the broader black community, we're challenged by the fact that our historical epistemology was not clinical. It was ancestralist. We are seeing, all we knew was, he's mad. So take him to the Sangoma or to Isanusi to be fixed and so on. Or this is a sign of the fact that the ancestors want to talk to him. You see, so we come from a cultural psychology that would not have led people to being healed, rather to being occupied by what we now know as demons. Get the point? And it's unfortunate that the church has not given serious attention to this condition, because we're now burdened with psychological challenges. Yeah, in all levels, in many spheres of life.
But Mandla, maybe you can come in here. Is there no truth to the fact that we do get possessed by demons? So, I mean, are we throwing that out then? Because there is such a thing as possession, isn't it? And it manifests in different ways.
My take is simple, is that I think the Christian religion as a whole, how it's been positioned, is really been positioned from a heroic point of view.
Yes.
And not from a position of weakness. In other words, you do find instances, for example, of depression, even in some of the heroes of the Bible.
Yes.
I mean, look at Elijah. After having conquered all those prophets of Jezebel, the next minute he's running away and he's sulking there by the brook, alone, depressed. And God had to snap him out of depression. So, but those stories we don't talk much about. We only focus on those stories where he's a hero. And my sense is that, therefore, that things like demon possession or maybe even mental issues, we don't really want to talk about. We're uncomfortable about that. And consequently, it's topics which are never touched. Yet they impact people directly, because they have to do with your perspective, with your mind, and how you relate and everything else. But that's something we actually don't touch at all.
I actually want to touch on something that you raised earlier on, the the hereditary aspect of mental health. And it just made me think, is that maybe what we refer to then as generational curses?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. In some cases. I'd wanted to say, perhaps we need to set up a formal redefinition of what we mean by being a Christian now. And broaden the scope of its application in human life. Because Western thought has created clones in our lives. It's school, it's church, society, it's work. It has destroyed the historic African integrated theory of integratedness of things, and that's where the Sangomas, these Anus have cashed in, because they are very universal in their thinking. By the way, yeah, they have an interpretative model that is able to say, even if sometimes they're mistaken, you got it from grandma, her grandmother's Alex, and so on. There is a concept of transgenerationality in the generational inheritance in the African community, but we never academized around it, because we were taught by missionaries that all this is darkness. It will not need academic discourse. So we need to find a mean between valid Christian thinking and valid African thought, because we are not treating Europeans generally in the African community. We are treating people who have ancestralism hanging at the back. By the way, it has been shown by statistics that more than 60% of people in this country who are Christians consult ancestralists, even Adventists, even pastors.
Can I add?
Yes, ma'am.
With regards to generational something?
Yes.
Yeah, I do believe that mental illness does go from generation to generation.
Yeah.
In other words, there is a genetic component.
Yes.
Just like with other illnesses, not necessarily the mental one. For instance, other illnesses like diabetes and high blood pressure has been found to run in families. And that's the medical perspective. But the traditional perspective, I think, we also believed in generational something like, we would say, hey, lo, abantu baloya muzi banjalo.
Yeah.
Banjalo. You know, we would simply say it's an illness of a particular family, or ukhamba lufuzu imbiza is very much like the father, you know.
Thank you. So there's some comments that have come through. Thank you very much. So Ule Msimanga uthi, to an African Zulu culture specifically, when you describe symptoms of anxiety and trauma, they will mostly say that you have indiki, which is initial steps for ubusangoma, similar to what Mfundisi has said. And then Mtuza Gafuze has actually got a question which I wanted to ask as well, in that, can then your religion or your spirituality play a role, a helpful role during mental illness? So he says, does a person's strong religious beliefs facilitate coping with existential issues better than the one who has weaker beliefs? So can a person in strong faith cope better when faced with mental issues? Does it help facilitate better dealing of mental health issues, your faith?
My take is this, that hope for anyone is one of the fundamental things, coping mechanism. And the Christian faith, therefore, has this hope. It's built on the concept of hope. And that is what really shields them most of the time from some of the challenges which people cannot deal. Because if you see everything ending here and with no prospect of any future, you have no reason to go on but to give up. That is why, if you read the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, when it said we are perplexed but not in despair. Yeah. So in other words, the hope element is what, it does not shield you from being perplexed, but it shields you from getting despair. In other words, it gives you a hope to look for solutions to fight yet another day.
But then that sounds similar to the positive psychology movement, or the positive thinking movement. So what's the different role that religion is bringing in? Because there's a lot of that, of the think positive, say yes mentality that's out there. A lot of self-help methodologies centered around that.
The distinction is that in the academic Western realm, you motivate yourself. You have to generate that, which ultimately amounts to salvation by works. You see, the salvation in the Christian sphere depends on a power higher than yours. You get the point? Hence, you can do nothing without me. You get the point? And I think one of the things that we should use in healing people who operate within a Christian paradigm is to generate hope in the one who's bigger than the problem. Yes. And that's why I think the Bible has told us the whole of the historic the table of history up to the second coming, so that we know which way things are going. Right now, Adventists are temporarily stressed, but they know this thing is going to die one day. They also know that's going to escalate one of these days to a very intolerable level, and then it will plateau and climax again to something more glorious. So I think, Mabel Khadebe, one of the things that the church failed to do, especially in the African sect, they gave pastors almost no education. Almost no education. Yeah, and we, which is why they could not do hermeneutics around social oppression, because they did not have the tools. All they could say was, "You're a politician, you're a devilish. We're not in that type of thing," and so on. We're going straight to heaven, and unfortunately, heaven has not arrived. You get the point? And the problems are compounded and complicated. And now you have a younger generation, the Mandlas and others, who are there saying, let's question this thing. Where is it taking us to?
Open Mandla is the younger generation.
with some of us.
Okay, do you want to say something? Because I have a question for Dr. Mabel.
Sure, I was just saying that, the contextual and existential issues,
Yes.
for example, within Christianity, were not highlighted for a purpose.
Yes.
Because remember that those things would have actually shown the wrongness of what the actions of the people were doing.
Yes. Yes.
So consequently, they had to shift the focus to something else. Give you somewhere else to focus, not on the things which makes you depressed, which makes you... And they had to actually almost, what's the word? Make it evil
Yes.
to be depressed. Or make it like you're a weak Christian if you are depressed, or make it like you are unbeliever if you cannot, you have mental issues. Because strong Christians are not like that. Yet on the other side, Bona, they were taking care of themselves on the mental issues.
Dr. Khadebe, does it help? So we've looked at being a Christian and needing counseling. Does it help make you a better counselor, being a Christian as well as a clinician? Does it help in terms of then the support that you give to your patients and the people who come and see you, your spirituality as a counselor?
I think so, because a lot of things that are helpful as a clinician are borrowed from Christianity. Like, as you said earlier on, focusing on positive thinking, helping a person change their thinking patterns, and giving hope. It's from Christianity. So when you are a Christian, you will focus on that. You will really give your patients hope. Because when there's hope, the present is bearable, even if the person is going through a storm. But when there's hope, the present is bearable. And as a Christian, that's just where you will use that for the benefit of the people you are helping.
I 100% agree. But one of the issues I have against the Christian faith is this using the hope again as a panacea for everything. And we're therefore discouraging people from coming up because, come on, don't bother us with this now. There's a better place tomorrow. Or where we encourage people not even to come out with these issues. And for me, I think Dr. Mabel is correct when she says that all of these things come with Christian faith. However, also the Christian faith has also been guilty of making sure that it actually, to protect itself from its other social ills, it therefore almost criminalizes or makes the other things evil. Case in point, why is it that people who have social disorders don't come out openly within our Christian environment, which is supposed to be loving, which is supposed to be caring? Why is it that they feel more unwelcomed to discuss these things?
And I think to add to that, and maybe you can think of this question, to add to that, I also read a study that actually looked at the negative impact of religion on mental health. And it talks about the fact that some of our beliefs can actually lead to some of the challenges we have. So if I'm going through something, God must be punishing me. And maybe it's because I don't have enough faith. When there's also religious guilt. There's religious guilt, Bazalani. You do something, you sin, right? And you know it's sin, but the guilt that goes with that can also lead you into lots of anxiety and stress and depression. The image of this angry God who's waiting to strike on you can fill you with anxiety and fear, and you walk around. I mean, a lot of Christians, their starting point of anything that they do is fear. Right? Because what if God then doesn't like this, or what if God doesn't approve of this? But also our beliefs have also caused us to others who are not of the same faith, right? So there's hatred that's created against other. We see weakness in those who don't overcome situations. When people feel that God is not answering their prayers, they feel abandoned by God. So all of these things can lead to mental health issues. So religion can also act as a trigger for these mental health situations rather than as a source of comfort.
Could we not then say that some of our resilience as Christians, which some of us look as heroism, is brave and so, could be based on wrong premises? I want to stick through this thing, because otherwise they'll say I'm weak. Get the point? When you know that you are collapsing. So I think wrong religious psychology has created a lot of hypocrites in all churches. Besides, we read the stories of heroes in the Bible who are higher than us in their faith and challenges, and we want to imitate them when we don't have the level of resilience that they had. You get the point? Yeah.
And Doctor, do you think this has led to then a lot of people not seeking help? Because, I mean, I'm a Christian, I must just pray, so my religiosity actually acts as a deterrent to me seeking help or seeking help soon enough.
Yes, it does. Besides that, it has chased quite a number of people from the church because of the way we look at them, the way we demonize mental illness. And when we see somebody struggling with a mental health issue, then we call a pastor and we call all the prayer warriors. They must pray and chase out the demon. And some people who don't believe even in demons, they then feel they are at a wrong place. They just don't come to church. They just disappear. And again, as a church or as church members, we stigmatize mental illness. And because of that, people who have mental health issues find it difficult to talk about that, find it difficult to open up. And that leads to what you have just said, to even go and get help. Because once they become aware that you are at Vista Clinic or you are, then, stigma follows you. So I think the church has a major role to play to destigmatize mental illness, so that people should feel at home in the church, so that people should get the support they need, encouragement and support they need, because definitely with mental illness, you need support. You need support, and that's what people don't get, especially from our church. I don't know other churches. And it is because of our limited understanding of mental health. So they suffer, they are isolated and they suffer alone. Meanwhile, they belonged to this church that should have made a home for them. Yeah. Those who are not Christians, or especially who are not Adventist, they find it easy to go for help. They find it easy because they are less stigmatized, less demonized. So as Christians, we really need a lot of education and a lot of changes that we need to do.
But are we saying prayer doesn't work? Is that what we're saying? Because I mean, what's wrong with getting olive oil, laying me here, laying hands on me, and pray this thing away?
Jesus prayed, but he also told someone to go to somewhere to have his eyes smeared with something. So Jesus used all forms of healing. What this church does is to pray only or curse the devil. When the devil might not necessarily be the cause of it could have been wrong behavior, wrong philosophical attitudes to life, or criminality that you have hidden and you have not confessed. There are many reasons why some of us go off in some cases. But the error of the church is to be superficial about the analysis. And the prescription then becomes insufficient, sometimes deficient at all.
So I came across an interesting term called religious psychosis or religious delusion. And this refers to a form of delusion that especially Christians carry, where I do things because God told me to, and because I believe this is what God wants me to. And I mean, a number of examples are cited. So there's extremes where there's mass suicides by people who, because God told them to. So we can, cite our very own David Koresh. I don't know if we want to own him. Or incidents of mass hysteria. Somebody who walks and doesn't know what is happening. There's just like crying and screaming and it's pity. There's incidents of eating grass or eat doom and things that we've heard about, all in the name of religion. And this is religious psychosis. Now, isn't this an outsider labeling what they don't know as a psychosis? Because who's to say that God didn't say this? Do you know what I mean? How do you challenge an issue of belief and say, no, that couldn't have been God, when God has spoken directly to those people and not to you?
This is my take on these issues. I think one of the devil's greatest scheme was to actually displace God's character and position God as something God is not.
Yeah.
Consequently, because we do not know God's character, we can't even tell when something is not from God.
Yeah.
God is in position, for example, as this judgmental person who's trying to look for faults, who's trying to make you bad. All the bad things about God. And so we worship out of fear. And I don't think, if you study the Bible, to show you how that God is love, that everything about God is love. But is that what you see? Is that what you feel when you talk to any Christian? When they introduce you Christianity, do you feel love, or do you feel judgment? Do you feel condemnation? Do you feel fear? That is why, therefore, it's easy, therefore, to actually use the same tools of fear, of judgment, to psychoanalyze people into doing things which are not necessarily of God.
But we Christians believe in miracles. So why would it be difficult for a Christian to believe that my miracle lies in that this doom actually is not doom, because God is a God of miracles. He's a God of doom as well.
Study the miracles that are in the Bible. No lethal object or article or force was used to fix things. None.
Strong suggestion.
Unless God was in control of that thing. Think of the snake. It worked under the control of a divinely ordered man. But the stick that Moses used had something bigger than the snake that the devil was bringing. Get the point? And I think we need to take time to analyze the miracles in the Bible, because they followed a particular logic that God had imposed on nature, but they were not destructive. And there was no use of things in a manner that would have been academically absurd. Like go to the pool of Siloam, wash yourself. It was something sensible, but they did not believe that it would remove blindness.
Mfundisi,
Yes.
you brought up Moses, so let me question you on Moses there. So we know in retrospect
Yes.
that stepping into the Red Sea just because he pointed,
Yes.
right? If I was there as part of that mess, isn't that crazy? Here's a whole ocean in front of you, and all this guy is going to do is to just point. The person who's back there, who's not seeing it opening, is just following Jay. Isn't that delusion? What makes you think that this ocean is not going to close halfway through? Because what's holding it apart? So how is that different from someone who's saying, yeah, no, I know it's grass, but God, if God says it, He has a plan. Maybe ngumhlonyana or something. I don't know.
Let me tell you something. When you study the Bible carefully, you'll always discover that an ultimate act, which may look mysterious to you or miraculous to you, is based on a particular epistemic logic that has led you to that point. These people had moved out of Egypt and they'd seen the plagues and other things. God kept them miraculously in those 40 years. You get the point? Otherwise, we need to explain how food came from heaven. Because some scientists say, no, it came from somewhere in the space here.
Well,
God created it in some way. How could it have traveled across the galaxies and so on from heaven?
true. And we also need to explain things like virgin birth. How does that make sense unless it's a question of belief, and someone who doesn't believe will look at it and say, isn't those is, and I know I'm pitting science against religion.
Yes, yeah.
But or things like, I've just had a comment here to say, how do you explain a father who takes his own grown-up son up to the mountain because God says, I must go and sacrifice you? Wouldn't you call that craziness? So how is that different from me saying, yes, I'm going to drink this petrol because it's by apple juice?
Every time God asks of a human something you would not normally ask of another, you'll discover that it has been part of a long trip of trust. Abraham had seen God do things. This time God wanted him to do the ultimate. So there was logic that led to the sacrifice.
And yet he didn't tell the mother. And yet he didn't tell Sarah. If he really believed God is going to fix it, this is God, why didn't he tell Sarah?
The test was on him. Not on the... I know this is an interesting subject. Yeah, but yes.
Because this is the mental health in a spectrum, and it's infinite. So there's things that really sound crazy that to someone who's not of us, that we say or even believe in, that they're like, yeah, I see those ones. Maybe they need to go and see Dr. Khadebe.
Let me make my last statement before Mandla speaks. Faith, by the way, is a form of intelligence.
Or delusion. Or delusion.
Not necessarily. Delusion is not faith. It's superstition.
But Mandla.
Yeah, you know what, Thandi, all the examples you see, for me, miracles do not define faith. You see, and they happen within a context.
Yeah.
No miracle happened in the Bible for the sake of itself.
Yeah.
There's always a purpose. That God is always doing something. It's just never just for the sake of itself. No, not one. So what is God trying to teach me about eating grass? What is the moral lesson in there? So if you follow, like Bob Gos was saying, there's a journey before a miracle.
Yeah.
It just does not, it's not an event. It's actually a whole journey. And a lot of Christians, therefore, which is why we end up thinking people are delusional, is because they treat these as destinations, as events.
Yeah.
And they don't look at the relationship which has happened before, of trust built over time, so that by the time it comes to this, I already have full confidence in the God I served, because He's already shown Himself to me before, and He's already revealed His will to me before. But you don't know this guy who tells you to drink petrol. You first encounter him. No, on what basis? That's delusion.
You explaining that as a Christian explaining that, and I'm saying as a person who doesn't have this faith, for me that looks delusional. It does look crazy, but the person who believes in this God and this faith will say no, and will have those explanations. But I want to bring, I'll come to you, Infinite. I wanted to bring Mabel Khadebe here as well to say, how do we So we want to create awareness at church about the fact that mental health is real. It's a thing, and it goes beyond prayer. Prayer is one of the tools that we use, but it goes beyond that. How do you start bringing that conversation that we haven't had? How do you start bringing it into and normalizing it into the space that we occupy?
I think what we are doing now is a good starting point. We need to talk more about mental health issues. But above all, I think the starting point is to educate the church about mental health disorders. Because if they have a better understanding, they would know how to respond to the issues. And various ways of educating the church would be like sermons, having sermons on mental health. It's normalizing it. And there's a lot that can be said in preaching about, like as Mandla has said, on depression. He mentioned people who were depressed in the Bible. And a preacher can expand on that to normalize depression, so that if I struggle with depression, I should really feel at home. And testimonies can be used to normalize mental health issues. We have people who have been struggling for years with mental health issues, and they can give testimonies how God has been with them, how God has pulled them through, how God has given them hope, how they relied on promises in the Bible to move on, especially those who struggle with depression. Seminars, and there are various platforms that can be used to educate the church. Various departments, the youth department can have talks or debates or something like what we are doing now to normalize it and to increase understanding of mental health. Then we, as a church, will be able to respond appropriately and effectively.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder to you at home, please join in this conversation. I'm sure there's a lot of questions that you have or comments or your own experiences as a Christian, as a church member, as a black person when it comes to these situations. Fundisi, you had your hand up before I go to my next question, or can I ask my next question?
Pass.
Okay. So I want us to bring it now to, so we create awareness, we conscientize people. Can these situations be prevented? Are there ways of preemptively preventing, breakdowns and mental health situations? How do we build an environment where it actually helps us to prevent because the numbers are seeming to be increasing. It seems to be that, the occurrence of whether it's depression, whether it's bipolar, whether the numbers are seeming to be on the increase. Is there a way of preventing, or do we only deal with it when it has manifested?
I believe prevention is better than cure. So there are ways of preventing it. If we look for them, we can find them. One thing is to know the causes, and then we'll be able to then focus on how we can prevent that. Causes, well, it's biology, as we said, about genetic predisposition, and then environmental factors. Then we can focus on environmental factors and see how we can modify those to prevent mental health issues. Family issues, fortunately here in church we are doing a lot of prevention, like we have family life, we have health. There are a lot of activities that help in prevention. Eating well is also preventive. Because mental health, as I said, is a biological, the brain needs to be well nourished. If you eat well, the brain will be well nourished and will be less prone to break down when the environment is too harsh. Prevention would also include education, parenting. Bad parenting can predispose children to mental health issues. We focus on that. There are many things that we can do to prevent stress management. Yeah, if we can learn how to manage our stresses, stress management seminars and all that, it could be preventive. But Christianity is also very helpful in prevention.
So it sounds like we already have these platforms, because the things you're mentioning, we have a health ministry that talks to food that we eat. We have departments, as you've mentioned, even here at Calvin and Ethel, we even have a counseling department. But for some reason, we don't seem to be tapping into those, or we don't seem to be maximizing or maybe using them correctly in a way that would actually help us. So it's not as destitute as one would think, but maybe we don't know how to use them correctly. Is that a correct reading, Mfundisi?
Yeah. There are challenges within the global and local Adventist culture, which tend to limit space for discussions and the deep problematization of issues of this nature. We need to puncture the structural rigidity of Adventism around the local congregation and start speaking not to the conference, but to the territory of mission. We are not answerable ultimately to the pastors in Orange Grove. We're answerable to the man above. Because that's the man who will want to know what we did with ourselves in this world. Unfortunately, because we were colonized, all colonial-related structures, including churches, want to collide around the person. Ultimately, the individual in the Adventist church has no authority even over his life, because it's prescribed to from the pulpit, from the school, and elsewhere. So we need a totally new model of what it means to be an Adventist, what it means to be a church, what it means to be a missionary, what it means to do the things that we've been doing. And I think, as Ellen White says, context is very important. We've failed to contextualize Adventism, even as Africans in Africa, which is why there's a struggle even in the African community about what it means to be a true Adventist. Some parts of this continent would not allow this discussion to take the route we want to take, for instance, which is why some people have a problem with churches like Calvin, because they are rooted in a model of churchmanship that is fixed, was fixed in Europe, fixed in the GC and so on. And yet those people have a churchmanship that responds to their context.
Fundis, I'm going to have to stop you there.
Please.
Unfortunately, time is always an enemy. I've got a comment I'd like to read here from Msimanga, and then I'll give Dr. Khadebe and Mandla the last words as well, just to finish
Thank
off.
you.
So like it says, hope in our faith is positive thinking. Hope in science is action. Yeesh. When one is struggling with mental health issues, they are in a very dark space and it's deep. So hope in a religious context inspires the first steps to healing. You begin by thinking positive. However, hope from a scientific perspective requires action, that you own your darkness and situation and begin steps to do something about it. The religious hope frames the thinking. The scientific is where the rubber hits the road, and practical steps are taken to do something about the situation rather than being on autopilot hoping things will get better. There must be a point of intersection of the two. Yes, Ngatuleko, we should have called him to come and be on the chair here. Thank you for that comment. Your last words, ma'am, before we finish off. I know I wish we had another hour, but we may need to come back. Just your last words on this.
What I want to say is that I'm very happy that we are discussing mental health issues, because I believe that being silent about mental health issues, especially mental health disorders, we are hurting those of our members who are battling with those disorders. And when we talk about them, we are making it easy for them to open up and to believe that, to get support, and to believe that we understand them. We are holding their hands. We are with them. And but for those who are already suffering, I would tell them about the verses in the Bible, that they should never forget the promises in the Bible. Like 1 Peter 5 verse 7. They must cast their anxieties upon God.
Amen. Quickly, your last words.
By the way, I did invite Lego. He's my brother. I did invite him because he's actually writing something on the subject. So I know that is something which is very close to his heart. Just to say one thing for me is that one of the critical things we need to be able to deal with as a church, as a people, is change, because that's the only constant in the future. But however, that is one thing we are so afraid of as a church to deal with. And to me, that's where our challenges start.
Awesome. Thank you so much at home. The ball is in your court. You've heard it here. No more stigma on mental health. No one is too old or too young to have situations that come up. And let us as a church community embrace them instead of making them feel worse than they are. Thank you for your time. We'll see you again next week on the next episode of Spotlight Conversations.